We continue now at the top of Daf Lamed Hey Amud Aleph and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 35a. On the previous Amud, the Gemara brought a brisa in which Rabbi Yehuda said that when the Karban Pesach was brought, a lot of karbanos were being brought at the same time. There was a concern that maybe the blood from one of the karbanos would spill out of the vessel that received the blood onto the floor and it wouldn't be applied properly. And so therefore what they would do is they would fill 1 cup with blood from the floor of the Azara and they would apply that to the Mizbeach, and that was essentially on behalf of everybody. They would have a mixture of all of the different blood that was on the floor of the Azara, and that was on behalf of everybody so that everybody could fulfill that obligation of the Karban Pesach. And in the Brisa, the Chachamim say back to Rabbi Yehuda, how do you know it didn't spill directly from the animal onto the floor? That can't be gathered up again. And now Rabbi Yehuda responds and says, Afanilo amarti elokeshen eskavo b'kli. I'm talking about a situation where it was in fact received in a vessel and then it spilled on the floor. Rashi explains, Afanilo amarti shei Yosef. I'm saying it should be gathered ela ben eskavo b'kli, where it was received in a vessel, then maybe it spilled on the floor, and so that's why we're doing this. And the Gemara continues, V'hu gufe mino yada, but how does he know that? Rashi explains the question, V'hu gufe Rabbi Yehuda mino yada shen eskavo b'kli. How does Rabbi Yehuda know that the blood was all received in the vessel and that the concern only is that it spills from the vessel to the floor? And to that, the Gemara answers, Kohanim's reason. The Kohanim are very careful when it comes to doing the avoda. V'yavdin haya, but they do the avoda quickly. There's a lot going on. Umishtavchin, so that it might spill out from the vessel, but they certainly will receive it in the vessel. And Rashi explains this reason, Heinu Mekabli Lakula, they are receiving all of the blood in the vessel from the neck of the animal. Again, there's just a concern that maybe one of them or some of them will spill, and therefore, again, they would fill up this cup from the blood that's on the floor of the Azara. And the Gemara continues, V'halo dam hatamsis ma'uriv bo, but isn't there also dam hatamsis, which is essentially the blood from the animal that is not the sole blood, that's the blood that comes out after the main blood comes out after the slaughtering, so some other blood comes out, that's called the dam hatamsis. Isn't that blood mixed in, and that should be a disqualification? You're going to fill this cup with the dam that's mixed in with dam hatamsis. And the Gemara says to that, Rabbi Yehuda l'taimi, Rabbi Yehuda here is following his opinion. The Yomar dam hatamsis kari dam, he says that dam hatamsis is called blood as well, and that's in regards to the prohibition of consuming blood. The Tanya, as we learned in a brisa, dam hatamsis ba'azhara. The Tanakama says if a person consumes dam hatamsis, it's just an azhara, it's just a warning. Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'kares, Rabbi Yehuda considers it like regular blood, and the punishment is kares. Rashi explains, Bi'azhara hey lavin ksivi bedam. There are 5 lavin, there are 5 negative commandments written by blood. Chad ladam hatamsis kedamrinim bekrisus beperakam, and 1 is for dam hatamsis. And Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'kares, Rabbi Yehuda says kares hasam yalef time over there in Krisus. They learn out the reason. And so again, therefore, since dam hatamsis is considered to be blood just like the soul blood, that's why that is not an issue. But the Gemara continues and asks, V'amar Rebbe Lazar, but didn't Rebbe Lazar say, Moder Rebbe Yehuda l'inyan kapara, that Rebbe Yehuda would admit as far as kapara, as far as atonement is concerned, in terms of the application of the blood on the Mizbeach, the Zrikas Adam, she'eino mechaber, that it is not considered an atonement, even though dam hatamsis, you get kares for that, but it's not the kind of blood that should be used for application on the Mizbeach. So how does this even help? Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, Ki hadam hu hanofesh, it says the blood is the soul. We understand from that, dam shehanefesh yotze bo kare dam, the blood which the soul departs the animal, that's called the blood. Again, the soul blood of the animal. Shein hanefesh yotze bo, but if it's not the soul blood of the animal, the soul doesn't leave the animal with that blood, ein kare dam, that's not called blood. And so saying that the dam hatamsis gets kares doesn't help us in terms of the application on the Mizbeach. And so the Gemara instead says, Ella rather, Rabbi Yehuda l'taimi, Rabbi Yehuda follows his opinion, the Yomar, because he says, Ein dam mevatel dam, that blood, one kind of blood, does not nullify another kind of blood. And Rashi explains, Ein dam mevatel dam, de min b'mino, because it's all of the same kind, Rabbi Yehuda lo batel, by min b'mino, when things are of the same kind, there is no nullification, according to Rabbi Yehuda, and so that's why Rabbi Yehuda says, again, you can fill this cup with the blood from the floor of the Azara. And the Gemara continues, Amar lahem Rabbi Yehuda, this is a continuation of the brisa. Rabbi Yehuda said to them, Lidivrechem, according to you, that we're not filling a cup of blood from the blood on the floor of the Azara, so lama pokakin hu Azara, why do they stop up They stop up the hole that would drain the blood from the Azara. They do this specifically on Pesach so that the Azara does fill up with blood. What's the purpose of doing that? Rashi explains, Lama Pokakin Esu Azara, Arvei Psachim, on Erev Pesach, they would stop up the Azara, Shalo Yotzu Hadamim Derech Amal in Nachal Kidron, that essentially the blood shouldn't leave through the drain system to the Nachal Kidron. Why do they do that? According to your opinion, that's what Rabbi Yehuda said to the Chachamim. Again, L'Divreichem Lama Pokakin Hu Azara, why do they stop up the Azara? Amru Lo, they said to him, the Chachamim said to Rabbi Yehuda, Sheva Chu Livnei Aaron, and the reason they do it is because it's praiseworthy to the sons of Aaron, to the Kohanim, Sheyeholchu Arar Kavosein Badam, that they should walk with the blood up until their knees. That is a praise for them, and that's the reason why that is done. But the Gemara continues and asks, V'hadam have a chatzitza, but isn't the blood going to be a chatzitza? Rashi explains, V'adam kahave chatzitza, or V'ha kahave chatzitza, bein ragleim l'ritzba, it's going to be a chatzitza between their feet and the floor. Utzanan omer al gabe kelim pasul, if the person stands, the Kohen stands on vessels, that's a disqualification, they have to be directly on the floor. Shouldn't the blood be a problem of a chatzitza? And the Gemara answers to that, it's not a problem of chatzitza because it's moist, it's still wet. V'lo have a chatzitza, as long as the blood is not dried, that is not a chatzitza. Ditzanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, and the Shinui and Nuschos changes this to Ditanya, as we learned in a Braisa, Hadam v'hadiyo v'hadvash v'hacholav, the blood and the ink and the honey and the milk, yevation. So if they are dry, so then chotzitzin, then they are a chatzitza. But if they're moist, ain't chotzitzin, then they are not a chatzitza. But the Gemara continues and asks, V'hakam mitavsi manayu, but don't their garments become soiled? Isn't that a problem? If the Kohanim's garments become dirty, that's a problem for doing the avoda. Utnan, and we learned in a Mishnah, and again, they changed the girsa to Vitanya, we learned in a Braisa, Hayu begadav metushtashin, if the clothing, the garments of the Kohen are dirty, V'yavad, and he does the avoda in that fashion, avoda so psula, so then the avoda is disqualified. V'chitayim, and if you're going to say demidlu lahu, that what they do is they lift up the garments so the garments don't touch the blood on the floor, V'atanya, but we learned in a Braisa, mido, we learned from the pasuk which says the word mido, kim mido, so that the garments of the Kohen should be exactly according to his length. Shalo yechsar v'shalo yoser, they shouldn't be less, they shouldn't be more, they should cover exactly the body of the Kohen, so it would be a problem to lift up the garments. And so instead the Gemara answers, Beholeches Eivarim Lekevesh. We're talking about a situation where they're walking the Eivarim, the limbs, to the ramp of the Mizbeach, the Lav Avodahi. That's not an Avoda, so therefore it's not a problem. And Rashi explains, Beholeches Eivarim Lekevesh, when walking the limbs to the ramp, Hadakatani, meaning that which we learned, Shevachul of Bnei Aaron, that the Braisa said it's a praise for the Bnei Aaron to walk in blood, that was only Beholeches Eivarim Kamar, it's a praise for them to walk in the blood when they're bringing the limbs to the Mizbeach, because that's already not an Avoda. Now the Gemara will ask later on, well, what about the blood? How were they able to walk when they were walking, conveying the blood, which is an avoda? How were they able to walk on the floor if there was blood on the floor? So it still doesn't seem to answer the question. But in any case, the point over here is that by holeches evarim, which is not an avoda, that wouldn't be a problem. But the Gemara continues and asks, Velo, but is walking the Evarim over to the Kevesh, to the ramp of the Mizbech, is that not really an Avoda? Vatanya, but we learned in a Braisa, Vehikriv HaKohen as HaKol, the Kohen's going to bring it all. Zuholeches Evarim LeKevesh, that refers to the bringing of the limbs to the ramp. So actually, it is considered an Avoda. So what kind of answer is that? So Ella, rather, the Gemara says, Beholeches Eitzim L'Marocha. We're talking when he would bring the wood to the area of the fire on the Mizbeach, that already the Lav Avoda. That's not an Avoda. But the Gemara still asks, V'la avoda hechi azli. But during the avoda itself, if there's blood on the floor, how do they walk? How do they convey? And the Gemara answers on that, Azli ha'itzdeve, they went on platforms essentially above the level of the blood, so it was not a problem during the time of the actual avoda. And again, when it wasn't the time of the avoda, so that's not a concern. They can lift their garments, and that would not be a concern. And Rashi explains, ha'itzdeve, they went on these platforms, itzdevos gevoen ha'yusham binyan avonim. These platforms were made of stone. They ain't on chotzitzin, so there was no chatzitza. Demin haritz bahin, since they were made of stones, it's considered like they're part of the floor, and therefore, again, that would not be an issue. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Hashochet as hazevach, if somebody slaughters the carbon lechol davar she'ein darko lechol, to eat something that's not normally eaten, meaning he has intention to eat something that normally would have been burned on the Mizbeach, and the idea over here is he has intention also outside of the proper time or outside of the proper place. Ulahaktir davar she'ein darko lahaktir, or to burn something on the mizbeach that, let's say, it's normally eaten, but he has in mind it's something that's not normally burned on the mizbeach. He has in mind to burn it on the mizbeach, again, outside of the proper time, outside of the proper place. So the Tanakama says kosher, it's kosher in that situation, since it was something that's not normally eaten, that he had that machshava. So that machshava, that intention doesn't count, and it doesn't create disqualification, it does not create pigul. Rabbi Eliezer posel, but Rabbi Eliezer says in this case, no, it in fact is disqualified. Lechol davar shadarko lechol. Now let's say it's to eat something that normally is eaten. Ulahaktir davar shadarko lahaktir, to burn something that normally is burned. However, it was an intention, again, outside of the proper time, outside of the proper place. Pachos mikazayis, on something that was less than a kazayis. So kosher, then also it's kosher, that's not a sufficient amount to be able to render pigul, to be able to create it either disqualified or make it pigul in the case of outside of the proper time. Lechol kachatzi zayis ulahaktir kachatzi zayis. What if he has intention, again, outside of the proper time, outside of the proper place, by a half a zayis to eat and a half a zayis to burn? So do those combine? So we say kosher, that's kosher also. Shein achil v'haktar mitzarfen, because the eating and the burning do not combine. And the Mishnah continues, Hashochet es hazevach lechol kezayis min ha'or. Let's say he slaughters the carbon to eat a kezayis from the hide. These are things that are not edible. Umin harotev, umin hakipor. Let's say it's from the rotev, which is the gravy. The kippah is the sediment. These are all insignificant things that people wouldn't eat. Umin ha'olol, umin ha'atzamos. We'll see Rashi in a moment about the olol, but from the olol and from the atzamos, the bones. Umin hagidin, and from the sinews. Umin hakarnayim, and from the horns. Umin hatalafayim, and from the hooves. All of these things are not eaten. Chutz lezmano v'chutz lemakomo, if he has in mind outside the proper time, outside the proper place, kosher, it is going to be kosher. Ve'ein chayoven alein mishum pigul, and there's no liability for pigul in such a situation. V'noser v'tamei, also no liability for noser and tamei in such a situation. What that means is, let's say you have a carbon that actually is pigul, so there's a liability to kares if you would eat from that carbon. But if you eat these items, let's say you eat the hide or any of these items that are not eaten at all, not considered to be edible, so then there's going to be no chi of kares for eating them, again, even though this is a carbon that was pigul, or let's say it was a carbon that was noser, that was left past the time, and again, you eat from these parts of the carbon which are not edible, or tamei, again, in that situation as well, there's no liability. And the Mishnah continues, Hashochet es hamukdashin, if somebody slaughters a carbon, mukdashin, Rashi is going to say, is specifically a female animal brought as a carbon, and he has intention, lechol shalil o shilya bachutz, he has intention to eat the fetus or the placenta outside of the proper time or outside of the proper place. Lo pigul, again, there's going to be no pigul in that situation. Hamolek es hatorin, somebody does malika. Malika is, instead of doing shchita, instead of slaughtering the birds, they would do malika with the fingernail of the kohen. So the person is doing the malika on the torin, which are the turtle doves. Lechol beitzehen bachutz, to eat their eggs, again, outside the proper time, outside the proper place. Lo pigul, that also is not going to be pigul. And finally, the Mishnah says, Chalev mukdashin, the milk again of these female animals, uveitze torin, and the eggs of the turtle doves, ein chayavan alein mishum pigul v'noser v'tamei. Again, if the karbonos that we're talking about are pigul or noser or tamei, and the person eats from the milk or the person eats from the eggs, they're not going to be liable in those situations. And Rashi explains, although that refers to the gid hatzava, Rashi says that refers to the sinews of the neck, shu kasha, which are hard, ve'in roy la'achila, and they're not fit to be eaten. And Rashi continues, ve'in chayavan alein mishum pigul, there's no liability for pigul for eating these parts of the animal that are unedible. Im haya hazevach pigul, if the carbon was pigul, shechishav al besaro al emurav, let's say he had intention about the meat or about the sacrificial portions, chutz lezmano, he had intention that it should be consumed outside the proper time, v'nispagel, so it became pigul. Ha'ochel me'elu potter, if he eats from these parts of the animal, then we say potter. And also same thing by v'tamei, let's say tamei, what does that mean? Emochel b'tumas haguf, let's say he's tamei and he eats me'achas me'el, again from these unedible parts of the animal, hazevach kosher, so then the carbon is going to be kosher. And Rashi continues, Chalev hamukdashin, the milk of the animal that's a carbon, Cholav shebedodea, that refers to the milk in the udders, Ein chayaven alein mishum pigul, there's no liability to pigul, and pigul bezevach, again, if the carbon is pigul, v'yachal mechalav, and he eats from that milk, lo mechayiv kares, there's no chayiv kares, to lav zivchuhu, Rashi says that's not considered to be part of the carbon. And the Gemara says, Amar Rebbe Elazar says, Pigel bezevach, if the person had intention outside the proper time, outside the proper place, by the carbon, so nispagel hashalil, so then the fetus has a status of pigul, b'shalil, but if the intention was with regards to the shalil, the fetus, lo nispagel hazevach, then the carbon is not considered to be pigul. And Rashi explains, Pigel bezevach means shachto al manas lechol o lahakter chutz lizmano. Again, he slaughtered the carbon with the intention to eat it or to burn it outside the proper time. So nispagil hashalil means ha'ochel me hashalil chayev. If somebody eats from the fetus, there's a liability over there. It's considered pigel. Bishalil, but let's say the intention, the wrong intention was with regards to the shalil, the fetus. Sheshachad es hazevach al manas lechol min hashalil chutz lizmano. He slaughtered the carbon with the intention to eat from the shalil outside the proper time. So lo nispagil hazevach, then the carbon does not become pigel. Kasavar Rebbe Elazar, Rashi explains that Rebbe Elazar holds shlil gufei deziv chahave. The shlil is part of the carbon. The uber yerech imahu, because the fetus is considered to be yerech imo, like the thigh of the mother. It's part of the animal. Umiu, nevertheless, ein machshavto mefageles hazevach. But the intention, if the person has the wrong intention by the shlil, that does not cause the carbon to be pigel. Why? The davar shein darko lecholu, because the shlil is something that people don't generally eat. The ruba de inshi lo achlile. Most people don't eat it. The fact that if you have the wrong intention by the shlil, it doesn't create pigel, that we learn from our Mishnah. Lechol shlil lo shilya b'chutz. It said again in the Mishnah, if he has intention to eat the shlil or the shilya outside the proper time or place, lo pigel, it does not create pigel. And so again, that's the distinction Rebbe Elazar makes. Pigel bezevach is considered to be pigel, of course, and that includes eating the shlil. There's going to be liability. But the wrong intention by the shlil does not create pigel in the carbon. And Rebbe Elazar continues, pigel ba'olol. Let's say he has a machshava, wrong intention when it comes to the olol. Now this again refers to the sinews in the neck according to Rashi, but here we're talking specifically about the olol shel oaf. We'll see Rashi in a moment. So the olol of the oaf is something which is in fact edible. You have the wrong intention there. So nispagla mora, so then the mora, which is the crop of the bird, that has a status of pigel. But b'mora, but if let's say he has the wrong intention with regards to consuming the crop of the bird, lo nispagil olol. So then the olol is not going to be pigel. Rashi explains olol shalof, again the olol of the bird, roy lachilu. That's something that is eaten, derachich, it's softer. Mora lo chazil achilu, but the mora of the bird, the crop of the bird, is not fit lachila, lo chazil achila, the pirsha bialmu. It's not considered to be something that people eat. Hilkach machshava dida lo mefagla. Therefore, if you have a wrong intention with regards to the crop, it's not going to create pigel. Umiu, now nevertheless, hechad nispagil ha'of al yedei davar acher. If the bird becomes pigel through something else, kevan diika inshi da'achli, since there are people who eat the crop, chayav olav kares. So if one does eat from the crop, and again we're talking about a situation where the bird is pigel, so then there would be a liability. There would be a liability to kares. And Rebbe Elazar continues, pigel be'emurin, if the person has the wrong intention with regards to the emurin, the sacrificial portions, nispaglu parim, then the bulls become pigel. But with regard to the bulls, lo nispaglu emurim, then the sacrificial portions do not become pigel. And Rashi explains, pigel be'emurin, again he has the wrong intention with regards to the emurin. This is talking specifically, says Rashi, shachat parim hanisrafim. We're talking here about slaughtering the parim hanisrafim. For example, the par helam davar shel tzibur, they were burned in their entirety, not on the mizbeach, but they were burned. So let's say he slaughters the parim hanisrafim al menas lahakter emurehen chutz lizmanan, and he has intention to burn their sacrificial portions outside of the proper time. So nispaglu parim, so the bulls actually do become pigel then. Ve'ochel mibsar, and if somebody would eat from their meat, chayiv, he'd be chayiv for eating pigel. But chishe beparim, if he has the wrong intention by the bulls, sheshachar al menas lechol mibsar and chutz lizmano, he slaughters the parim, the bulls, with the intention to eat from their meat outside the proper time, lo nispaglu emurim, then the emurim will not become pigel, his chayiv kares, meaning there's no chayiv kares, ha'ochel mikloyo, so miyoseres hakavich alehem, these are the sacrificial portions, the emurim, if you eat from those, there's no pigel. The kol sheken de lo nispaglu parim, and certainly the bull itself is not going to become pigel. Lo nispaglu parim atzman, the bull itself, the bulls themselves will not become pigel. Sharei chishav lechol davar shein darko lechol, because the point over here is these are parim hanisrafim, they're meant to be burned, so your intention was to eat something that's not normally eaten, that does not create pigel. Essentially, what we're really saying is, beparim, when you have intention in terms of the parim to eat the parim at the wrong time, so that's not an intention of something that's normally eaten, doesn't create pigel at all. V'aydi denakat pigel be'emurin. Now, since the language of the statement was pigel be'emurin, so then we say lo nispaglu emurin. But really, in the case of pigel beparim, there's no pigel whatsoever. So since it said again pigel be'emurin, nakat nami lo nispaglu emurin. That's why it says lo nispaglu emurin. But it doesn't just mean the emurim are not pigel. Everything is not pigel in such a situation. And the Gemara continues, Lema Messiah, let's say the following brisa supports Rebbe Elazar's statement. The Brisa says, V'shavim, and they both agree, we'll see Rashi in a moment, Shem chisha ba'achilas parim, if he has intention in the eating of the bulls, uvisreifasan, and in their burning, lo asa v'lo klum, that's nothing. And so the Gemara says, my lav, is it not saying, hachisha be'emurim, let's say the wrong intention would be by the emurim of the bulls, so then nispaglu parim, then the parim would in fact become pigul, and that would be consistent with what Rebbe Elazar said. And the Gemara says, lo, no, and Rashi explains, lema misaya leila Rebbe Elazar, let's say that this supports Rebbe Elazar, diamar mispagil v'afal pi she'ein mefagil. The main point is that Rebbe Elazar said it's possible for something to become pigul even though it doesn't create pigul. Could go in shalil, umoro, v'sar haparim, like the examples that Rebbe Elazar gave, where again you can have a situation, for example, nispagil hashalil, but if you try to do pigil b'shalil, lo nispagil hazevach. And again, the Brisa says, v'shavin, they agree. This is Rabbi Shimon v'chachamim. We're talking here about Rabbi Shimon and the chachamim. Shenechliku b'perek beis Shammai. They argue in perek beis Shammai later on. The Rabbanan Amri, the Rabbanan say, pigul and noheg b'parim hanisrafim. There is a concept of pigul by the parim hanisrafim, again, by karbonos of bulls which are burned. For Rabbi Shimon Amar, but Rabbi Shimon says, kol she'eno al mizbeach hachitzon. Anything that's not burned on the outer mizbeach, ein chayav and all of mishum pigul. There's no liability of pigul. So then we say on that machlokas v'shavin, now they agree. Shem chishe be'achas me'avodos hadam. Let's say he has intention during one of the blood avodos, lechol min haparim l'machar, to eat from the bulls tomorrow, o l'sorfon beveis hadeshen kel chaso l'machar, or to burn them in the beis hadeshen, that's why they were burned, but again, to do that tomorrow at the wrong time, lo asa klum. So in that situation, everybody agrees that is nothing. It is not going to be pigul in such a situation. The machsheves achila lo mahan yebuhu, because in a machshava, an intention with regards to eating, that's lechol min haparim l'machar, that's not going to help by them. The davar shein darko lecholu, it's something that you don't eat. So in terms of lechol l'machar, that's not going to be pigul. What about the case of l'sorfon beveis hadeshen at the wrong time? Umachsheves sreifa namilo. Also the intention, if the intention has to do with sreifa burning, that also doesn't count. The machsheves achilas mizbeach kapid rachmana, because we talk about a machshava where, let's say, it's the consumption of the mizbeach eating the carbon. There you have that intention that the mizbeach should consume it outside of the proper time. That's pigul. Avol sreifa, but the burning, lav loshan achilahu, that's not a language of achila at all. V'afagav da'amrim beperkin dela'el chishev shetochleu eish l'machar pigul. Now, even though we say earlier if he has intention that the fire should consume it tomorrow, that's pigul. Hani mili dechashe b'loshan achila. That's only if the intention was in a language of achila. Kedeuki hasam, like we say over there. And so that's why, again, even though there is a machlokas tanoim between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Shimon in terms of whether pigul applies by the parim hanisrafim, everybody agrees in this particular scenario, where again it's lechol min haparim l'machar, these are parim that are burned, they're not eaten, or l'sarfon beveis hadeshen l'machar, everybody agrees that is not going to be pigul. And the Gemara then said, my lav, is it not? Again, the Gemara said, if the intention would have been in the emurim, it would have been pigul. My lav, had the pligi rabbanan, that which the rabbanan argue, the amri pigul noheg bohem bebesar bebasar de parim, that they say pigul does apply to the meat of the parim, bebasar de parim atzmo ka'amar, we're talking about the meat of the parim themselves. Dimchisha be'emurim lahaktir l'machar, meaning, if the intention by the emurim was to burn them the next day, tomorrow, outside the proper time, to chashav ki or chayu, that again is an intention which is the normal thing you do with emurim. V'achilas mizbeach nispagel besar haparim leonish kares al achilaso. So then we would say that that intention about the achilas mizbeach would cause that the meat of the parim would be considered pigul, and there would be a punishment of kares on the achila. Isn't that what we're saying? And so therefore, again, you see this very same distinction within the chachamim, that the chachamim essentially say pigul be'emurim nispaglu parim, but beparim lo nispaglu emurim. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Lamed Hey Amid Beis.